Friends, it's great to be back with you again for another Before You Read lecture. This is the Before You Read lecture on the first, about third of the Gospel of Luke. Luke chapter 1, verse 1 through Luke chapter 9, verse 50. And by the end of this lecture, you'll have a better understanding of why I've stopped there, why I've stopped our first week of reading there. Since this is our first time studying the Gospel of Luke, just thought I would provide some basic orientating material about the Gospel of Luke and its author and that sort of stuff. Generally speaking, although there is some disagreement, scholars recognize that the Gospel of Luke is likely the last of the first three Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These three are known as the Synoptic Gospels because they can be seen together in columns, because their stories and their storylines are so similar that very often we can line one story up against the story of the other two Gospels. Most scholars think that Luke is the latest of the three, although, again, there's some reasons and some that disagree. We can't know for certain when Luke was written. I generally tell people that it was written in the last third of the first century BCE. Some date it earlier than that, and some date it significantly later than that, into the first quarter of the second century. But I think generally the consensus is it was written sometime after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70. So sometime in the mid-70s or mid-80s, that might be a good range. As with our other New Testament Gospels, the author of the Gospel of Luke is actually unknown. So it is technically an anonymous document. Church tradition associates this Gospel, the third Gospel, with Luke, who we learn of as a traveling companion of Paul in the book of Acts, as well as in some of Paul's letters that mention Luke the physician. While we can't be certain if this character named Luke is the actual author of the Gospel of Luke, we have some clues that suggest that the author was possibly Gentile, making the Gospel of Luke one of the only, if not the only book in the New Testament that is written by a Gentile. But it seems as though this Gentile was what is known as a God-fearer. These are a class of non-Jews, ethnically non-Jews, Gentiles, who sort of associated themselves with and connected to the ancient synagogue, but didn't make a full conversion in the form of male circumcision. The Gospel of Luke, at both an English level and certainly at the Greek level, is a literary masterpiece. It has some of the best and most sophisticated Greek in all of the New Testament. It is beautiful and refines these earlier traditions, adds some of its own unique traditions, is written in most likely with this 2 volumes. So the book of Acts is the second volume of this 2-volume work. And one of the just amazing things about the way that Luke works at the level of the Greek is that if you open up the beginning, the first 1, 2, 3 chapters of Luke, it's as if you're reading from the Old Testament in Greek. The Greek is very similar, the mannerisms are similar, but by the time you get to Acts 28, the end of the second volume, that style of Greek has changed almost entirely. It becomes a more cosmopolitan and more sophisticated form of Greek than what we might see at the beginning of Luke or in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So it is just a beautiful and engaging read, I think, both in translation and certainly in Greek. Luke, like Matthew and John, is dealing with certain social and theological issues. I think that those social and theological issues are a little less pronounced than in Matthew or in the Gospel of Mark, but they seem to revolve around 2 topics or 2 themes. The first is the church's relationship with the saving heritage or the saving legacy of Israel. So while Luke is really clear that he's writing to describe what God has accomplished, what God has fulfilled, the new thing that God has done in and through Jesus Christ, he grounds that in Israel's legacy. He connects that to Israel's legacy and really understands the ministry of Jesus and that of the early church as a continuation of the ministry and reality and arrangement of Israel. The second issue, social issue, really has to do with the place of the Jesus movement or the early church within the larger Roman world. How does Christianity fit within the social and religious world of the first century Roman Empire? So that's the broad or general orientation to Luke as a whole. I want to point out just a few things about Luke's opening, things for you to be aware of and maybe pay more attention to, and then offer a few questions at the end that will be strategies for your reading. So from the very beginning of Luke, the first thing that you should notice is, unlike any of our other Gospels, Luke begins with what is known as a prologue, a sort of introduction, a preface, if you will, to the Gospel. And it is directed to a character named Theophilus, which in Greek just means lover of God. And it's very likely that Theophilus is the patron of Luke. This is the person who funded the Gospel writing project, which in the ancient world would have been costly. And so Theophilus, or Luke's dedication or his preface to Theophilus, sets a tone for the gospel as a whole. It tells us something of Luke's intentions in writing, as well as what he hopes to achieve with his writing. The next thing to notice about about Luke's opening, rather, is what I would call Jesus's prehistory. The gospel doesn't start with his genealogy, as we saw in the Gospel of Matthew. It doesn't start with the preaching of John the Baptist, like we saw in the Gospel of Mark. Instead, it starts with these two elderly characters named Zechariah and Elizabeth, who are to become the parents of John the Baptist, the cousin of Jesus, according to the Gospel of Luke. And these two characters have important connections. They play a key role in connecting the story of Jesus to the story of the Old Testament. Zechariah is a priest, and Elizabeth comes from a priestly family. Elizabeth, like many of the women in the Old Testament, is barren and elderly and longing for a child, and miraculously she is given one. Another thing to notice about this discussion or this portrait of Zechariah and Elizabeth and into the birth narrative of Jesus is the presence of hymns and songs. If you're reading in a modern Bible, chances are there's going to be a lot of indentation in the first 3 chapters of Luke. It is almost as though there is a continuous praise song going on. The things that God is doing through John the Baptist and through the arrival of Jesus cause the characters to shout out in almost spontaneous praise of God. Again, this is a continuation of the Old Testament story in the characters of this new story. In Luke 2:41 through 52, we get our only portrait of Jesus as a child, as a tween, maybe, if that's the right word, who gets caught up in the temple and left behind in the temple as his family travels back to Nazareth. Again, a precious glimpse into the childhood of Jesus. From there, the narrative really begins to resemble, in large part, what we've become accustomed to from the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew. It starts with the ministry of John the Baptist, and it moves into the baptism of Jesus, and then the temptation. Luke includes the genealogy sort of in this section as opposed to in the beginning like Matthew. And in Luke 4, we hear Jesus' first sermon. And I think that this is an important sermon because as Jesus reads from the words of the prophet Isaiah and applies them to himself, we get a clear understanding of Luke's understanding of Jesus's vocation, as we'll see play out later in the gospel. From there, the narrative really does pick up. We get a series of teaching and healings and controversy stories that, again, really will seem familiar. They will remind us of what we've seen in the earlier Gospels. Now, why do I break us at 9:50? Well, not to steal my thunder from my next lecture, the answer is in what happens in 9:51. In 9:51, the text reads, "When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem." So this middle section of the Gospel of Luke is really it's called the travel narrative. And it provides Luke's narrative the opportunity to sort of delay the material between Jesus' passion predictions, those 3 times where Jesus says, hey, this is what's going to happen to me in Jerusalem, and his actual arrival in Jerusalem. And so one of the important literary features of this middle section that we'll study next time is that it allows the reader to spend a little bit more time with Jesus and spend a little bit more time learning what all of this means for discipleship and for life in the world. And so the reason we stop this session at 9:50 is just to prepare ourselves for the middle section, for the travel narrative. As you read, I invite you to pay attention to 3 things, 3 questions. The first is, how do these opening chapters, this first section in Luke, how does it continue the story of Israel? In what ways does Luke ground the story of Jesus in the story of Israel? A second thing for you to look at is the relationship that Luke portrays between Jesus and non-Jews, between Gentiles and Jesus. Notice if there's anything surprising in these chapters and elsewhere in the Gospel of Luke. And then the third question to pay attention to is the social nature of the healing stories. This is something that my advisor, Luke Timothy Johnson, has written about extensively, but it gets at the fact that the miracles, the healing stories, are not just about the restoration of health or the elimination of an evil or impure spirit. There is a communal dimension to these healings as well, and this is an emphasis in Luke's gospel that is perhaps not as clearly seen in the other gospels. So pay attention to the ways in which the miracles restore people to community, or they create opportunities for new community. Well, I am eager to hear your thoughts and your reflections on the Gospel of Luke as you encounter these first 9 chapters or so, and I look forward to discussing them with you soon. Thank you so much, and happy reading.